now come to chapter 6 of Daniel in our series called Spiritual Living in a Secular World. And we have a new king from the Medo-Persian Empire. His name is Darius. And the chapter starts with the way the new king governed his empire. It says in chapter 6 and verse 1, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss." So he had satraps who were really, the idea is kingdom protectors. That's the meaning of this, kingdom protectors. And 3 presidents who are the higher officials. Daniel was one of these presidents. And verse 3 tells us, then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So Daniel again is distinguishing himself. And we are told, of course, that people get jealous of him and they start looking for ways to charge him. But in verse 3 we are told that he has an excellent spirit, and that's why he did so well, better than the others in doing his job. You know, this is something that is very important for a Christian who goes into society. We represent a glorious God, the God who created this world, who made this beautiful thing called nature, and we represent him. And everything that we do for his glory. 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, "Whether you eat or drink, do it all for the glory of God." Whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And so we are committed to excellence. When we do a job, we must do it well. I still remember speaking to a businessman who was very high up in a company. And he told me, you know, I of course don't like to get these committed Christians into my company, because suddenly they don't come for work saying they had to go for this retreat and they have to go for this prayer meeting, and they don't do their job properly. I was so ashamed of that. God calls us to do both, to go for the prayer meeting and to do our job properly, and that's difficult. But we have to do our job well, because we do it for God, whatever the job is that we do. Well, what happened with Daniel, even though he did his job so well, was that he experienced resistance. We are told that the others were looking for a ground of complaint. They were waiting to see whether he had done something wrong. This is in verse 4. Now, this is a case of professional jealousy. Daniel was polite and respectful, but he was also capable, and he got things done. And when you get things done, you tend to climb in your job, and then people begin to criticize you and you face opposition. That is sure. You know, some people of course play safe. They remain without much progress. They just stick to the rules and don't do anything special, and they get little criticism, but also they make little contribution to church and society. So here Daniel is facing jealousy, and what a destructive force jealousy is, especially if someone you don't respect or like is promoted above you, which is what happened in the case of Daniel. You begin to look for points which show that this person is not qualified for the job, and generally you can find points about everyone, good people and bad people. You can find negative points about everyone. So I just want to warn you, be careful. I have seen Christians do this. When somebody else is promoted above them, they begin to show the weak points of that person, and you realize this person is jealous. You know, I've seen people ruin their lives through their jealousy, because they act irrationally and they lose credibility, and people don't respect them because they know that they are jealous. Now, it must have been very hard for Daniel, who was a very gracious person, as we saw right through this book. He was a gracious person, polite, and now he is facing ungracious reactions because of his hard work. You know, we are called to love everybody. People who like us and don't like us, we love them. We are polite to everybody. We try and help people. But when they don't reciprocate our love, but respond rather with hostility, that can be very hurtful. But remember, Jesus said that in John 15:17. He was the nicest person. He was the most godly, loving, humble person you could ever find. But Jesus himself said, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. So when we find resistance after all our hard work, don't be disillusioned. Don't be bitter about it. It's quite normal. Paul said, indeed, all those who seek to live a righteous life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. That's 2 Timothy 3:17. The Salvation Army was, I have mentioned this in the Salvation Army in my series before, was a great movement. God did some amazing things through that movement. You know, a lot of people came to know Christ, a lot of poor were helped. However, because they were doing unorthodox things and reaching out to people whom others had thought they couldn't reach, others were critical of them. Now, they were working with the poor. And the Earl of Shaftesbury was a wonderful evangelical Christian who worked for the poor, who was a politician, and he worked for the poor. But he didn't like the way the Salvation Army was operating. So one day he announced at a meeting that he has done a careful study of the Salvation Army. And he says, I am convinced that Salvation Army is clearly the Antichrist. The Bible talks about an Antichrist, an evil person who leads people astray. And he associated, this good man associated the Salvation Army with the Antichrist. And another person in the audience added to that by saying that he has studied the name William Booth and that the letters of the name add up to 666. 666, of course, is the evil letter combination that Revelation talks about, when evil begins to take hold of this world, when it's coming towards the end of history. So here is this good man, good work, criticized. They were often attacked in the press. And William Booth, of course, who was the founder of Salvation Army, was especially attacked in the press. One day his son found this very hard. His son's name was Bramwell. And Bramwell found this very hard, and he showed an attack in the newspapers about the father. And the father told the son, Bramwell, 50 years from now, it will matter very little how people treated us. It will matter a great deal how we dealt with the work of God. Our calling is to be faithful, to do our job well. People will criticize. That is their problem, not ours. Well, verse 4 tells us. So verse 3 talks about his exceptional qualities, and because of which he was promoted. Verse 4 talks about his character. So verse 4 says, then the presidents and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, no error or fault was found in him. You know, today, capable people are very often not good people. Sometimes when somebody goes to the top through capability, we think, oh, he must have done something wrong, he must have broken some rules to come to the top. Good people sometimes are not capable. Oh, they are nice people, but they don't achieve much. So achievers are normally considered not good. Good people are considered not achievers. And this is why our young people are revolting against authorities, because they've seen how these people exploit power and come, come to the top in the wrong way. Daniel was capable and good, just like Jesus. Achieved a lot, but also was a good man. The New Testament mentions 13 times the statement that we are supposed to be blameless in this world. In 1 Timothy 4, chapter 4 and verse 12, Paul talking to Timothy about how young people are rejecting him because of his youth. He says, don't let anyone despise you because of your youth, but give an example. Through your life, you better give an example of the way you behave, by the way you behave. The answer is to be blameless in the world. So, we try to be blameless. Of course, we all fail. And then when we fail, of course, we confess and receive God's forgiveness and the forgiveness of the people against whom we have sinned or done something wrong. And so we must be very careful that we don't go through life with a burden of guilt, because that takes away our freedom and our joy. Now, three particular things are told about Daniel. First, we are told that he was faithful or trustworthy. Now, in 1 Corinthians 4:2, Paul says, it is required that a servant, a steward, should be found faithful. If God is going to use us, we must be faithful. What it means is that when we are given a job, we do the job. You know, sometimes you think, oh, he didn't achieve much, but at least he was a faithful person. That's not what is meant by faithful. Faithful people are people who do the job that they are given to do. And they don't give excuses. I had a headache, so I'm sorry I couldn't do my job. And if we can't do the job as we were asked to do, right at the start we say, I'm sorry, I don't think I can do this job. Or even in the middle, if we find that we are finding it difficult, we say, it looks like I'm going to be delayed. Please excuse me, I'm going to somehow finish this as soon as possible. In other words, we are faithful in that we give a good report, a real report. We can be trusted. We are trustworthy. And so, Daniel was a person who could be trusted. There was a girl who had 5 coins in her hand. And her brother asked her, how many coins do you have? And she said, I have 10. The brother said, no, I don't think you have 10. And she opened it and said, oh, you got only 5. And the girl said, no, my father said he's giving one in the evening. And if daddy says that he's going to give me 5 coins in the evening, then I have 10. She knew that her father will keep her word, his word. And so, as far as she was concerned, she already had 10 coins. I think this is very important for us as parents. We must never break promises that we make to our children, and never make false promises, because then we are known to be unfaithful people. I think some of us are quite exhausted. I remember when our children were younger, we used to be quite exhausted because I make some promises to too many people, and then I have to fulfill the promises, and that results in exhaustion. If you have to break a promise, as I said earlier, explain, apologize, don't try to hide it. We are trustworthy people. Secondly, we are told that there was no error found in him. The NIV, the New International Version, says this, that he was not corrupt. We must be honest people, not only faithful people who do our job well, we must be honest people. Now, you know, today a lot of people say it's impossible to be honest. And it's very sad. I was talking to a business executive yesterday, and a person who actually is a consultant in business. And he was talking about how bosses teach their people to cheat their customers and government officials. Bosses teach their people to do that. And these people learn to cheat, and they end up cheating the company. And this has happened so often. Dishonesty really doesn't do ultimate good. But, you know, everyone agrees that corruption is ruining our countries, ruining our companies. But everyone says we can't help. We are forced to do it. We can't help it. So we will do this. What to do? And of course people ignore. Corruption is going on. Everyone ignores. But when people are angry with you, then they bring up your corruption. Otherwise they ignore it. So for us in Asia, this is a huge challenge. We know it's destroying our countries, but we say we can't help it. We, people of God, must be different. because very many people don't have a concept of God like we have. We have a concept of God that says He is supreme and that He is holy. People who follow Him must be holy, keep to the rules. And it says that we are accountable to God. One day we are going to be judged for what we have done. There is going to be a judgment. And that is the major reason why we are not dabbling in corruption. Well, in the Bible, one of the major reasons why we are told not to take bribes or give bribes is because there is a judgment. And people who take bribes are going to be judged by God, says the Bible. You know, that's not the idea that many have of God. To many, God is a some magical formula. You give this to this God and the God will give you this. He is one who, just gives us things. That's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is one who demands our whole lives, the one who asks us to hand over our whole life to Him. Now, it is a great challenge for us to communicate this idea so that people are truthful and honest in our culture. I have found that three things are helpful in nurturing people to live honest lives and not to be corrupt. The first is that we practice community. The Bible says we walk in the light, and as we walk in the light, we have fellowship with one another. That's 1 John 1:7. In other words, we are truthful to each other. If we are truthful to each other, then we can have fellowship with each other. If we don't tell the truth, we can't have fellowship. So when you have a close fellowship, a fellowship where you're expected to be truthful, untruthful people either change or they leave. And I have seen both happening in the communities that I have been involved with. When they realize that you can't get away lying here, some people just stop lying. Others find it a little too uncomfortable and they leave. So we practice community, a community where people walk in the light. Secondly, we don't lower our standards. When you realize that somebody has told a lie, you insist on total honesty. So if somebody says, I got late because I couldn't get a bus, actually the reason is that the person slept late, and you know that. You know the person is lying. Now very often we'll just ignore it. Not if you are children of God, because God doesn't like lying. God hates lying. And so you ask, now discreetly, you don't have to humiliate the person. You ask the person, really, was it because of a bus? Or is it that you got up late? So we don't lower our standards. We insist on total honesty. And then we teach people the whole counsel of God. We practice community, we don't lower our standards, and we teach people the whole counsel of God. In other words, we tell them what kind of God this is, a holy God to whom we are accountable, who's going to judge sin, a loving God who wants us to give our lives to Him and enter into a daily relationship with Him. And so when we give this, people realize the seriousness of sin. We talk about the sacrificial system, how sin was so serious that God had to send His own Son in order that we might be forgiven. We realize that sin is serious, and then you begin to value holiness. Today, many new Christians know only that God is powerful, because they saw that God met a need of theirs, and then they came to God, and they realized that God will bless and care for them. Well, that's what attracted them to the gospel. However, soon they must be taught the fuller picture, that God is holy, that God demands total dedication, that God is a God who will judge our actions. Then the third thing, so he was faithful, he was not corrupt, and then we are told they found no fault in him. Now the NIV explains this by saying they were not negligent. He was not negligent. Carelessness is often the mother of sin. A lot of people who do terrible things don't plan to do those terrible things, but they were careless, and one thing leads to another, and they end up doing a terrible thing. For example, they make promises that they can't fulfill, just carelessly say things, and then people get disillusioned and disappointed. Or they'll start a building without really budgeting how much this building will cost. So then they have a plan that is unrealistic, and then they get into hopelessly into debt, and they are crippled by debt, by being careless. They spend more than they should on a wedding reception, and the poor couple have to start their life in debt because the parents decided to have a wedding reception for show that they really couldn't afford. The weak people do things like this. Strong people will say, we will live according to our budget, about how much we have. Or some people forget to keep accounts of official expenditure, and then they end up lying because they have they don't know what to do. They don't know how some money went. Others start rolling using office cash for their own purposes. Now they plan to return it, but sometimes it gets so big that they can't return it, and they end up committing a fraud and never plan to do it. Some people are careless about the internet, and little by little they become addicted to pornography. Some people are careless about talking too much with a person of the opposite sex. It starts very nicely, but then they talk too much and they end up having an affair. So they can, through carelessness, we can get into situations that can be very harmful. They didn't intend to, but because of their carelessness, good people have ended up committing fraud, have ended up being crippled by debt, by having an affair, and sometimes resulting in a divorce, and becoming addicts. So let's be careful. Well, we are told that in verse 6 that he does the will of God even if it angers others. What happens is that these people couldn't find anything that was negative about Daniel, but there was one area, verse 5. And these men said, we will not find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. So they agreed. And what did they do? They had a nice proposal. The king was new, so they said, why don't we have a situation where unless that for 1 month, everybody in the kingdom prays only to the king, just 1 month. So it's a nice crafty way of attacking Daniel, because they knew Daniel won't pray to the king, even though he's such an important official. So and it's 1 month, so people will survive for 1 month without praying to their God. They'll just pray to the king. So they bring this. The king, of course, is taken in by this plot, and he accepts it, and he gives this decree: don't pray for anyone to anybody except to the king for 1 month. Well, verse 10 tells us that Daniel knew that the document had been signed, but when he knew that, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem, and he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks to God before his God, as he had done previously. He has been told not to preach, not to pray, but that's his job. That's something that's non-negotiable. They realized what he has to do with God, he's going to do whatever happens. And so he went, as was his normal practice, went to the window, faced Jerusalem, and he prayed. This prayer, of course, is a sure sign. A prayer in our life is a sure sign that God is most important. There are some people who don't care so much, and they don't spend time praying. And if you don't spend time praying, it's a sign that maybe God is not most important in your life. Thomas More was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that is like the Minister of Finance in England about 400 years ago. And one day he got a message from the king saying, come, while he was having his time in the chapel praying to God. And the king said, I want you to come. And he sent back a message to the king to say, tell the king that I will attend to the king after I have attended to the King of Kings. He was not going to let his time with God be taken away. I think our children should know this. Our children should know that whatever we do, the time with God is the most important. I grew up like that. My mother would be, every morning when I get up, my mother, my grandmother, they would be praying. And so I grew up realizing that prayer is important. So Daniel put God first in his life and paid the price for that. If we don't, we may be able to thrive in your job, in our job, but we won't thrive in life. And you know what Jesus said? What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Daniel was willing to lose everything, but he was not going to compromise his time with God. So let me close with that by telling you that you may find people jealous because you do well. Always be gracious. Always try to do your job well. And always give God the first place in your life. God bless you.